My name is Bruce Oliver Newsom. I lecture at the University of San Diego on all things defense, security, and risk. And I am welcoming you to this panel discussion on the future of the United States Navy to 2030 and beyond. And for this, I'm cooperating with a colleague at the University of California, San Diego, retired Vice Admiral Robert Thomas, who is now a senior research fellow with the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, and formerly commander of the US 7th Fleet. Vice Admiral Robert Thomas assembled a panel: Gerry Roncolato, a retired Navy captain, Paul Giara, a retired naval aviator, and Scott Tate, another retired Navy captain. So we have a submariner, 2 surface warfare officers, and a naval aviator on this panel, stellar panel, to discuss the future of the United States Navy. Welcome you, enjoy.
Well, it's been 3 years now, and when Bruce asked me, hey, Robert, let's have a discussion about the future of the Navy, I quickly assembled a group that actually does know what's going on. So let me introduce them really quickly, and then Bruce, with your permission, after I run through a quick bio of the 3 panelists, then we'll have the panelists lead us through the opening part of the discussion. The first speaker you're going to hear from is Gerry Roncolato. Gerry and I served in the Navy in a lot of different posts, especially in the Pentagon. Gerry's a retired Navy captain. He served in surface warfare, surface warships. He commanded the destroyer, the Sullivans, which was a DDG-68, a guided missile destroyer. He was also the Destroyer Squadron 26 Commodore ashore. He had several tours in Washington, D.C. He's generally been associated with plans, policy, and strategy. In particular, not just on the Navy side, but also on the joint side, including a focus on the Asia Pacific. He currently works as a consultant for Beast Code, which is LLC, and they build interactive and user-friendly digital twins for the Navy. The second speaker you're going to hear from is Paul Giara. He's a retired Navy P-3 pilot. He's also served in aircraft carriers. So it's good to have somebody who actually has expertise in the aviation arm of naval warfare. While in the Navy, he was designated as a strategic planner. This is an effort that we went through in the Navy to actually identify strategists and educate them appropriately, including, kind of this identifier, a subspecialty code. And that led to him, really playing a leading role in the Chief of Naval Operations Staff. That's our Chief of Navy. As a senior country director for Japan in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, he managed the US-Japan alliance for 5 years, and then really developed the rationale for the post-Cold War bilateral security relationship. So again, steeped not just in Navy strategy and kind of looking forward, but also, again, you notice the Asia Pacific expertise. He's currently the president of Global Strategies and Transformation, which is a national defense and strategic planning consultancy. And then the third speaker you're going to hear from is Scott Tate, a retired Navy captain, served in warships, commanded Mustin, DDG-89, and USS Zumwalt, one of our newest destroyers. Ashore, he served on staffs. In fact, he was my executive assistant when I was the commander of the US 7th Fleet. So I basically, as I tell people, whatever you thought of my tour in 7th Fleet, just blame Tate. He's also worked on the US Pacific Fleet Commander staff. He's worked on the Joint Staff, again, in the politico-military affairs portion focused on Asia. He's currently the executive director over, literally his office is next to mine on campus, at UC San Diego, the National Security Innovation Catalyst that he directs. That's sort of a collateral duty because he's also the CEO of Pacific Science and Engineering Group here in San Diego. So you can tell you've got significant expertise to look at 2030 and beyond. As we tee this up, Gerry Roncolato is going to really kind of provide a scene setter and kind of get after, you know, the war fighting and why the war fighting. Paul will then kind of ratchet that into the future naval war fighting aspects of it. And then Scott's going to actually bring you down into the tactical level and some of the disruptions that are either challenges or available as opportunities as we look 2030 and beyond. So with that, I'm going to, Bruce, if it's okay with you, I'm going to turn it over to Gerry Roncolato.
Greetings. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. I'm very excited about it, and I'm honored to have the opportunity. I will up front try to promise not to use too many acronyms and to not be to overly obfuscate my comments with terms. But Bruce, or if you see me going down too much of a technical path, then just holler or wave your hands and I'll correct. What I would like to do is look at the war part of the future of warfighting. So what is this war thing? And I'm going to assume some familiarity amongst the audience with conflict and war and war theory, but I'm going to run through some stuff pretty quick to try and set the stage really for what is the difference between what we have been doing for the last 30 years and what we might be doing in the not too distant future as great power competition reasserts itself. So hopefully that will set the stage for discussion by the other two panelists, and then of course the question and answer period. All right. So first, I'm gonna look at kind of take a Clausewitzian approach. So Karl von Clausewitz's work, he defines. It's a very dense book. It's difficult to get through, but he basically defines war in two fundamental different ways. One is what he calls the fundamental nature of war, which is the unchanging part of war. It's based on the fact that war is an act of two or more actively opposed wills trying to impose themselves on each other. So it's a human endeavor, and certainly in the United States Navy and almost all navies, we're kind of techno geeks. I mean, we like technology, we like things, and so we get absorbed by the things and how the things work and how to set them up the best way possible. We tend to downplay the human element because technology has asserted itself so much in the last 50 years or 70 years. So what he says is human nature is what defines war, and he breaks it down to rational thought or planning on one leg, passion on another, and of course chance on the third. So that's his trinity of war. So the fundamental nature of war stays as is. It's continuous and constant throughout human history. What changes is what he calls the character of war, and this is what's conditioned by the stuff that we normally study: technology, geopolitics, alliances, given different strengths and weaknesses amongst the participants, whether it's militaries or societies and so on and so forth. So the character of war in any era has to react to the particular circumstance of that era, but it plays out within this environment of the human interaction that is really the fundamental nature. So what is this dual nature of the human nature and the character of war? How does that play out for the people who have to be practicing this profession? And certainly technology is a huge factor, and mastering technology has never been more important than it is now. But also there are other things, and Clausewitz kind of talked about what he called the wrestler analogy. And in war, because you have an actively opposed enemy who's trying to unhinge you and undo you, you get into situations that you can't get into if you don't have that enemy. So in wrestling, you can practice all the moves you want, but it really there's positions you cannot get into unless there's a wrestler opponent who's putting you in those positions. And having done a little bit of wrestling, I can tell you some of those positions are not painless. Let's put it that way. But so from the fundamental nature of war, character of war, how that plays out for the participants, the commanders, the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, the Marines, is you have what Clausewitz would have called chaos, you have uncertainty, you have fear, you have exhaustion. It's an exhausting, anytime you read military history, you get a sense of how exhausting it is. And then, of course, all of this combines to form what Clausewitz called friction, which means that what you think you want to do, first of all, requires an incredible willpower to execute and make happen. And secondly, it's going to fall short. And this is the context that we have to think about as we think about future war. Many of us have spent time watching movies that portrayed this, that, or the other. But in recent wars, this has been largely, this chaos, uncertainty, fear, exhaustion, friction has been largely at a very low level. My son was a Marine corporal. He did 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. And for him, that was a pretty big war. For the senior officers, less so. And for the United States Navy, we haven't really been engaged in conflict in this way for a very long time. Some people say the Cold War. I tend to say World War II. So let's talk quickly about history. Where does history play out in this, and what's its? And the only reason I want to bring this up is because the common view today, certainly in the Navy, is that history's kind of nice to know. It gives you exciting stories, but it isn't terribly relevant to what we're doing today. Whereas if you look at what the U.S. Navy was thinking in another era of rapid technological change without a lot of practice, peacetime, from 1873 to 1898 or 1890, they believed that the only way they could understand the technology that was coming out and how it would apply was by looking at history and seeing what history had to teach about the role of technology in war. And this is largely a naval perspective because, in 1798 or 1789, or any late 18th, early 19th century, the most complex machines in the world were Navy fighting ships. And so, sailors have been technologically focused for a long time. So the late 19th century U.S. Navy believed or tried to understand the role history played in illuminating what technology is going to do in the future. Second thing about history, so that was history and technology. The second thing is history and theory. And so, in the United States Navy, we all do genuflect at Clausewitz and Sunza and Mahan and Corbett. But it's kind of like, okay, I got that, now I can go about my business. But if you're facing an entirely new phenomenon, which we are, with great power war in this modern era, with the geopolitics as they are, the technology as it is, how do you begin to understand what's important and what's not? How do you begin to prepare yourself mentally for what is coming when you had certainly no practice in your career, and arguably your father and mother's career didn't have any practice in this? So absent constant practice, only theory can provide a critical foundation for understanding and preparing for an unknown future. In other words, theory allows you, if you use it right, allows you to build mental agility, the intellectual flexibility you're going to need to face and resolve unexpected situations, because they're going to happen. A guy named Professor John Sumida, who was taught at University of Maryland, wrote 2 excellent books on this. One was about Clausewitz and one was about Mahan. They're small, they don't hurt you if you read them at night and they fall on you. And he's very, very clear about both those guys, Clausewitz and Mahan, did not write about theory so that practitioners could take it as a checklist into war. They wrote about theory to help fill in the gaps in any history of war, and therefore allow the student to prepare themselves mentally to empathize with prior commanders and understand and begin to sense what's important and what's not important as they go forward in their own careers. And that's what theory is about. And so Clausewitz and Mahan valued it. In the interwar U.S. Navy, Mahan was kind of the foundation piece of the training and education of the officers. And that theory combined with what I would call heuristics of be aggressive, shoot with guns, and have individual initiative, that's how the Navy got ready for World War II. And arguably, we did okay. With that background, so the nature of war and the use of history and theory versus technology, let me just very quickly go through kind of a comparative look at, okay, what is post-Cold War era warfighting from the American perspective look like, and what might it look like in a great power war era? First of all, I can't go through very much of it. It's going to be pretty superficial. But secondly, whatever I'm saying here should not be taken as any kind of criticism of the practitioners of war during the post-Cold War era. I was one of them, and as was everybody on this panel. And we fought the way we needed to fight, and that's an important thing to remember. Oftentimes a British naval historian, H.P. Wilmot, once said, you know, countries don't fight where they want to; they fight where they have to. And likewise, practitioners fight the way they need to prevail. But it's going to be fundamentally different as we move forward. So let's talk first of all scope. What's the scope of a war? Post-Cold War, and really post-World War II, they've been very limited in scope. Both in terms of what the war aims are, what the size of the theater of war is, the level of effort required, the national commitment, and cost in blood and treasure. Great power wars historically aren't like that. They tend to expand geographically. Their aims change as the cost in blood and treasure accelerates or goes up. Then the need for mobilization of the society means that aims change so that the sacrifice is, quote, worth it to the people of the country. So scope explodes, and you go through, you look at World War I, World War II, and even the Napoleonic Wars, you see this happening. Society, what's the role of society? In post-Cold War era, it's been largely, and you could almost go back to Lyndon Johnson on this with his idea of Vietnam and the Great Society. But in post-Cold War era, it's been, we can fight these wars to support our national interest, and meanwhile, the rest of our society will be able to just go on as usual. And that's what we've seen. If we go into great power conflict, great power competition even, it's going to take much more of a commitment from our society and the potential for mobilization, both industrial and human, and the impact that will have on home life. Next, so scope, society, theory of victory. What are you trying to achieve, and what are the expectations for this? Okay, so in the post-Cold War era, basically to put it in a bumper sticker, victory means everybody comes home, and if you have casualties, then you did something wrong, and you have very low casualty rates. Great power war, instead of victory is everybody that is we don't take losses, the enemy does take losses. In great power war, the answer is whoever's left standing at the end is the victor, and so the amount of casualties, the cost and treasure and blood that it incurs is not as important, because great power war is by definition an existential war. You're fighting against an opponent who can and wants to unhinge and undo your society. Next is the enemy. In our experience in Southwest Asia, generally the enemy didn't quite get a vote. But as we're going into a great war competition, great power competition, the enemy's going to get a vote. And this is a fundamental shift for the U.S. military in general and the U.S. Navy in particular, where if the enemy doesn't get a vote, or if the enemy gets a vote, then you have to account for what that enemy is doing in a way that means you're not the only one setting the agenda. Command. In the post-Cold War era, we had the luxury, again, because the enemy didn't get a vote, of being very meticulous in our processes, in our command and control. The great power conflict with the enemy, constantly maneuvering and shifting to unhinge us, that won't be true. We will have to be much more flexible, much more agile, which gets to speed and tempo. And because of the aforementioned issues, in the post-Cold War era, we were able to set the tempo. We fought the way we wanted to fight, when we wanted to fight. And because the enemies were irregular forces that were pretty much stuck to the theater of operations, they had to react to us. That's not to say it wasn't dangerous and it wasn't war, but it was different. In a great power conflict, because by definition the opponent is capable as us, then they can impose tempo on us and force us to do things. So in the pre-Cold War or post-Cold War era, you might say the 100% solution is what you were going after because of the political content of the wars. in the great power warfare era, you know, you may have to get used to 60% solutions and go with it from there and adjust on the fly. This is not something we've been used to doing. The difference between a good commander and a great commander, as Admiral Arleigh Burke once said, is about 10 seconds, and that is coming back in. Finally, I want to just a quick talk on doctrine, not to steal the thunder from Paul or Scott, but what we're going into is, in the post-Cold War era, we could set our doctrine, use standing orders and pre-planned responses, and set rules of engagement, and very mechanistically apply those to the battlefield, because the enemy wasn't countering us in any significant way. What we're coming to is great power warfare, where you never try the same thing twice, because the enemy's going to figure it out, and he's going to beat you at your own game. Victory will go to the side that correctly learns battlefield lessons the fastest and integrates them into updated doctrine. And, you know, yes, the United States built a 6,000 ship Navy in World War II, and that's why the Japanese had a little trouble with us. But more importantly, the Japanese could not learn their lessons and incorporate them in updated doctrine. The United States Navy did that extremely well, and it was one of the keys of our victory that often gets lost in the sauce. So that's my opening remarks on kind of war, what it is, and how it's going to look different in the future.